Shabbat Shalom, family and friends. Today's Torah portion is named Pekudei, which means accounts of. It takes place in Exodus chapter 38, verse 21 through chapter 40, verse 38. The reading of the prophets includes 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 51 through chapter 8, verse 21. It also includes Psalms, chapters 71 and 72. And the renewed covenant reading is in Revelation, chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, and chapter 15, verses 5 through 8. So there have been a number of Torah portions discussing the tabernacle and how it should be assembled. In fact, last week's Torah portion was named Yakel, and he assembled. In this week's Torah portion, we see the tabernacle being set up and used. This Torah portion takes up the last chapters of the book of Exodus, and it ends with the Lord filling the tabernacle. Now note that the tabernacle was erected on the first day of the first month in the second year of the Exodus. It was erected kind of early on during their 40 years in the wilderness, although for them it probably felt like a very long time because they didn't realize how long it was going to take them to get to the promised land. But so once the tabernacle was completed, a cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And this indicated that the Lord approved their work. Now, this is the same cloud by which the Lord went before the people when they came out of Egypt. So the people recognized this cloud and what it meant. When Solomon completed the building of the temple, it was also filled with the glory of the Lord in the form of a cloud. In the prophet's portion of this week's reading, we learn in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 11, that the priests could not stand. They couldn't even stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. During the time of Zedekiah, that glory had departed. We see that in Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 22. However, later on in Ezekiel, in chapter 43, Ezekiel has a vision where the glory of the Lord comes into the temple and tells him in verse 7, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name. The glory of the Lord will not return until it fills the millennial temple. But going back to Exodus, throughout their journey, the children of Israel would not leave until the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle. It was something that the people would look towards. I imagine that many people would wake up each day and look to see if the cloud had moved. I imagine that even throughout the day, people would take a glance towards the direction of the tabernacle to see if the cloud had moved. And that's because their day would be dictated by whether that cloud had moved or not. And this situation is not too different in how we should live our lives, because we have also not reached the promised land. We've left Egypt, and we are on this earth as ambassador of God's kingdom, where we're waiting for the Lord's instructions on where we need to be. So day by day, we need to look for God's presence to dictate our lives, because where we are now is not where we need to be. We're on a journey like the children of Israel of old, where we're surrounded by desert and wilderness, but there's a special place that God has in store for us. In chapter 40 of this Torah portion, we see how the tabernacle was arranged. The first thing we read is that Moses put the Ten Commandments into the Ark of the Covenant. The Ten Commandments representing God's Word, God's law. We then see how the mercy seat or atoning cover is then put on top of the ark. The mercy seat was where God would meet with Moses, and it was also the place of transference of sin for forgiveness, representing reconciliation between God and man. It shows that between the Lord's law and Yah himself was his mercy. There was a veil then between the Holy of the Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant sat, and the rest of the tent of meeting. Next in that chapter is mentioned is the table of showbread. At the start of each week, the priest would place 12 loaves of fresh bread on the table, one for each of the tribes. And this signifies how the Lord continually provided for his people as they traveled throughout the wilderness. In the Lord's Prayer, we ask that God give us our daily bread. In John chapter 6, verse 35, Jesus notes that he's the bread of life. The one who comes to him will not be hungry, and the one who believes in him will never be thirsty. The table is on the north side, and across that table is a lampstand, a golden lampstand that is, which resembles a tree with 7 branches, with leaves, flowers, and in fruit engraved into it. It acted as a memorial of the original tree of life that was located in the Garden of Eden. It was lit and acted as a spotlight so that one's attention was focused on it. Jesus notes in John chapter 8 verse 12 that he is the light of the world, and the one who follows him will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Another article mentioned that made up that tabernacle was a gold altar that was in the tent of meeting, but right in front of the veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tent of meeting. Now, the incense used on this altar could not be used anywhere else on punishment of death. Okay, so the purpose of this altar was to kind of have this incense, this burning incense that can't be used anywhere else. And the reason why this was treated so seriously was because it represented the intercession the priest made on behalf of sinful humanity before the true and living God. In Hebrews chapter 7 verse 25, it notes that Jesus is able to save forever those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. In chapter 40, Moses then sets up the curtain for the doorway of the tent of meeting. And in front of the tent of meeting is the altar of the burnt offering. Okay, and it's once you walk into the tabernacle, you would see that burnt offering. And the altar was there to symbolically take away people's sin through a sacrifice of atonement, just like what Jesus had done for us. And what's interesting is that the tabernacle would always be facing east. So the Holy of Holies would be on the left, on the west side of that tabernacle, and the sacrifice of atonement was on the east. What's interesting is that the Mount of Olives is also east of Jerusalem, and it's actually in Ezekiel where we read where there's mention of the of God's presence coming in, from the east, and it's actually in the east where they believe that Jesus was crucified, where he gave his life up, and also where he was resurrected. Now, between the tent of meeting and the altar is the laver, which was a wash basin placed out in the courtyard of the tabernacle. And this was where the priests had to wash themselves ceremonially so as to be consecrated or set apart for ministry. Interestingly, it was originally constructed from the bronze the Israelite woman used as mirrors, which meant when someone looked into the water, they saw a reflection of themselves, which might have reminded them of their fundamental need for forgiveness. So the purpose of the tabernacle is for God to dwell with his people, for him to get closer with his people. But I find so fascinating that these items in the tabernacle, they also relate to our human senses for the priest to feel closer to God. And when I say human senses, I'm referring to taste, sight, smell, touch, and hearing. You have the table of the showbread that has bread on it, bread that could be tasted. And then you move on to the lampstand that is providing light, so then you could see what's inside that tent of meeting, to give you sight. But then you have right in front of the curtain, you have the altar of incense that is providing a smell that I'm sure that can be smelled anywhere else, because remember, it's isolated to what's going on in the tent of meeting. So I'm sure whenever the priest walks in and smells that, he's always going to attribute that smell to Yahweh, to God. Then you have, touch. When we talk about the altar, the altar where sacrifices are made, I mean, there's a lot of touch involved, not just the touch of the heat that's coming from this altar as items are getting burned up, but even when items are sacrificed, you're placing your hands on them, you're cutting it up and feeling the inside of these animals as you kind of separate what's going to be sacrificed and what's thrown away. So there's that touch, and then there's also that hearing. I mean, we talk about the altar of the laver, the wash basin, and so I don't know if you ever, they're putting their hands in there, washing themselves, but you kind of get to hear that water drip, and I don't know if you ever, I find that to be a very calming type of thing to hear, is when you hear kind of water being moved around and dripping, something very, soothing about it. But all of this to kind of show that God has done so much for us for us to be closer to him, to understand him more and more. I mean, even now we don't have the tabernacle that can be seen, or the aromas to smell, but we do have his word. We have his word that's kind of describing how he related to Israel of old. And I think this is just one more thing to praise God for as we enter a new week, because God he's so awesome. So Shabbat Shalom.